for that introduction. I don't know about the brilliant just yet. Very much a beginner. So yeah, I'm joining you from the University of Warwick in the UK. I'm currently doing my master's there with Professor Massimiliano Lacertosa as my MPhil dissertation supervisor. I don't know yet what it's going to be, but it's probably going to be on the Zhuangzi and nature. But this is not what this paper that I wrote for that master's program is about. Basically, my project was to answer Sarkissian's claim about the Zhuangzi's primitivist section, that we should take seriously and literally the claims that the primitivist makes about violently abusing the sages. And I don't think that's quite right.
Sorry, would you like to share the slides or any?
I don't have slides because basically, so I had some slides, but I realized that they weren't going to be that useful or not add much to the discussion, because I don't have, for instance, formal logic where it's very nice to have it in front of you.
Don't worry.
So just as a reminder, the primitivist section consists of Pian 8 to basically the beginning of 11 of the Zhuangzi. And in it, and I'm going to start by describing Sarkissian's argument about that section, there's a notion of a golden age, right? A golden age that was happening in the past. And it was an era in human society when progress was at a standstill, and the people were content with the little practical knowledge that they had. They were ignorant, not because they spurred education or had some learning disability, but because there was just nothing for them to learn. The problem is that this golden age was ended by the sages, and the sages created cultural artifices with their emphasis on innovation, culture, refinement. They inspired future artisans and deranged people's senses, generated mutated and unnatural desires. And they also, created distinctions such as shufei or youwei, and those are the source of political categories. And they developed standards and measures. Objects became categorized, objectified, isolated from their natural setting, basically. So the claim is that the primitivist claim is that the sages are the source of disorder. And worse than that, they are currently, at the time of the writing of that section, adding more and more laws and thus compound the problem. However, according to the primitivists, there is something that can still be done about that. And here I'm quoting from Sarkissian. Put briefly, while he, the primitivist, believed it futile to try and govern the world as it was, he thought two strategies could allow the world to perhaps govern itself. The first one would be to obliterate artifice and silence those promoting it. And the second one would be follow this policy with a program of containment and restraint to suppress the reappearance of those cultural artifices. And the thing is, non-purposive action, wu wei, would not do. If the people still find artifice in their midst, they would just not let go of it. And therefore, these codes and their material iterations need to be completely destroyed. According to Sarkissian, the primitivist could have been a scholar who, faced with the turmoil and the chaos, the disorder of their time, saw alternative methods of governance. Some people may be swayed by measures such as wu wei, but that would not be enough. It seems more realistic, according to Sarkissian, to consider using force. We'll go back to that point a bit later. What Sarkissian says, and that I agree with, is that wholly denying the more literal interpretation of the primitivist writing seems unwarranted. So I agree with that, but I'm trying to find the more likely way that these passages were intended to be read. So another thing that I agree with from Sarkissian's paper is that the historical context of the writing of that primitivist section really matters. So for our purposes, it's really important to note that the primitivist section was written during the transition between the late Warring States period and the early empire, i.e. the half of the 3rd century BCE. It was spent in a context of intense political upheaval, violence, tension, and importantly, ripe with centralizing and imperialist tendencies. And to understand the issue at stake, I think we need to assess a notion that in the Zhuangzi, anthology is peculiar to the primitivist part, and that is the notion of xing. So xing is sometimes translated as inborn nature. And when the primitivists wrote, xing corresponded to the spontaneous characteristics or dispositions of an object or being, insofar as that object or being naturally possesses those characteristics or dispositions, or will develop those characteristics or dispositions in the course of an unobstructed life cycle. So the primitivist was situated within a debate about xing. It can be said, and whether it can be said to be good or bad. Other people or scholars that dealt with it were Mengzi, Shunzi, Yangist scholars as well. And the primitivist disagrees with both Mengzi and Shunzi on the effect and desirability of rituals. It's not even a given that that the primitivists would argue, like Mengzi, that xing is good, or that it contains the sprouts of goodness. Xing just is for the primitivist and should be followed in virtue of its being xing, and that's it. But it's nonetheless important to be aware that their conception of xing is not situated in a vacuum. It's part of a much broader debate. What's very important with xing is that we should not interfere with it, according to that primitivist section. And I also follow the interpretation according to which some of those processes and aspects of one's behavior are more conducive to the flourishing of life and a healthy life. And those particular processes are the ones that are emphasized in the concept of xing. So with that in mind, what's the problem? Well, as Sarkissian pointed out, the people's xing is muddled because of the sages. Back in the age of perfect virtue, the people were simple, shunned knowledge, and exercised their virtue, so without the need for either benevolence, ren, or righteousness, yi. The primitivists see all these elements as social artifices. Relatedly, the people did not indulge in music or ritual. Their xing was just supu, so uncarved, unadorned, a bit like soil. And in addition to that, and linked with that, is the problem of the senses. Cultural artifices overstimulate and divert the senses, and this distorts people's xing again, which leads to less successful practice, but also to being hurtful. So the example in Pian 9 of Boluo, the horse master, who instead of letting the horse be and express their xing in a natural way, let's say destroys and debilitates the natural spontaneity of their xing. So much so that by the time he's done domesticating them, half of the horses have died. Similarly, sages such as Huangdi, Yao, or Shun have put shackles on human xing, and these should be removed so that people can recover their de. At this point, I think it's important to have a look at the readership, the problem of the readership, in the sense that a salient feature of any text is its intended readership. And in the 3rd century BCE China, only an estimated 10% of the population had basic literacy and numeracy, and a fraction of that had the kind of high literacy that was needed to read and interact with the Zhuangzi, which entails that the audience of the text, as well as the primitivists themselves, were part of the ruling elite, composed of scholars, ministers, and potential administrators. And some within this elite had gained an immense amount of influence by the time the primitivist section was written. And here I'm talking about the Shi. So when the primitivist is calling for action or non-action against the sages, he's not being a demagogue. So if we're supposed that he's talking to the ruler, for instance, well, there's a problem. If we take the literal reading, saying that we should cudgel the sages and kill the sages, if the ruler tries to rule in a sagely way, then it's probably not going to work, is it? In the sense that the ruler would probably not agree with that, not agree to being killed, and they would think it's counterproductive or evil. There's a second, more practically and historically likely case, which is that the ruler does not care about sagely rulership, but rather about what's efficacious. And for Sarkissian, there exists some corroborating evidence in the historical record that supports the plausibility that someone such as the primitivist might have explored the possibility of undertaking such a violent project of censorship. This person could be the advisor of the first Qin emperor, or Qin Shi Huang himself. And here, the Sarkissian uses the strong influence that legalism held over the Qin dynasty, which led to an acute suspicion and revulsion toward the intellectual as a kind of historical precedent. However, this suspicion is not really shared by the primitivist in the same way for the same reasons. Rather than being about the efficacy of rewards and punishments, their concern with intellectuals was more about, the contingency of knowledge with regards to the political problems it is called to resolve. For the primitivist, the sage's knowledge of governing practices is the problem. Instead of solving issues, this knowledge creates and worsens them. And as Quek puts it, Zhuangzi makes problematic the efficacy of governance itself. The text does so by appealing to historical precedent. So here there's the story of Viscount Tiancheng, who usurped the state of Qi and was able to retain it for 12 generations. And he did so with the laws of the sages. This idea of questioning governance itself is really helpful because it solves a problem that my argument could have run into. Even though the primitivist was indeed part of the ruling elite, it does not entail that they were criticizing every single shi or their method. It could be the case that the primitivist section was meant to interact with legalist scholars and to attack, for instance, Confucian sages. But this questioning of the efficacy of governance itself provides us with a response to that possibility, in the sense that Sarkissian thinks that one might wonder which of the proposed alternatives, basically doing nothing or using codes, or forcefully ordering the population by silencing critiques, is more plausible given the historical setting. But if we assume that the latter option could be considered applicable, fair enough. But if we accept that the primitivist makes problematic the efficacy of governance itself, then their potential collaboration with legalist scholars would have been nipped in the bud. And that is because governance, as it was practiced, then involved extremely violent action. Sarkissian argues rightly that as conditions deteriorated, people were scholars were starting to get fed up with, let's say, traditional ways of dealing with things and of ordering society. And the problem is the kind of violent methods that Sarkissian's literal reading entails was already part of that mix of potential policies. Arguably, the primitivist wishes to carve a third way, which does not rely on sagely rule or the kind of violence which led to the execution of the literati in 212 BCE. So Sarkissian does evoke this questioning of governance, but derives different conclusions. So using Graham's translation, he understands as these are matters for which laws are useless. And for him, this shows that the primitivists found other tools of governing or ordering, such as imperatives and legislation, fruitless. This is true. But the reason why the kind of intended policy that a literal reading of the primitivist should be seen as another kind of ordering tool than legislation or imperatives is unclear. Indeed, the literal reading of the primitivist section recommends a degree of censorship that would have to be put in place by the state. It would have to be put into law. Social pressure would not be enough. It would be extremely violent and extremely broad, and that's not the kind of thing that would be going on without the state, notably because, as was said earlier, the primitivist was writing at a time where the power of states was increasing. Centralizing and imperialist tendencies were widespread in the courts of rulers. And this process had been developing over the course of the Warring States period. And the problem is, from a practical point of view, laws are in a way useless in this context because they would be enacted against those that devised them, i.e. the shi. And from a theoretical point of view, the primitivist is exactly against this sort of authoritarian method, since he questions the efficacy of governance itself, if we accept that. And the sages, the problem is the sages played a key role in the structuration of large states. The primitivists saw this imperialist tendency as the path towards the kind of social, political, and cultural structure that would push humans further away from their xing, i.e. a problem. So at this point, and this is the last section, there's the problem of the sage's xing, the sage's inborn nature. If the primitivist condemns the influence of the sages, they do not claim that the shi are wicked or evil, rather they're misguided. The disorder which arises from their artificial rules and standards of the sages is unintended. The sages, for instance, at some point compared to water, and water has no will, it just follows its xing. The sages follow their xing and think that they're doing well, but it is not that this xing is not genuine in the sense that it's not supu, it's not uncarved. Their sageness is basically like their own sixth finger. What is meant by that? In Pian 8, the primitivist writes, 2 toes webbed together, a sixth finger forking off. These come from the inborn nature, but are excretions as far as virtue is concerned. These excrescences correspond to artificial and natural codes and standards forced upon humanity by sages and kings. The text indeed argues that these are useless, in the same way those who impose similar excrescences to vital organs and senses are overnice and deluded. But the person who holds to true rightness, and this is a quote, does not lose the original form of his inborn nature. So for him, joined things are not webbed toes, things forking off are not superfluous fingers. Watson argues that at this point of the text, webbed toes and sixth finger become natural deformities and do not depict artificial unnecessary morality, which would damage the logical soundness of the argument. I think another reading is possible. What the text seems to indicate instead is that these artificial codes, because of their prevalence in Chinese society at the time, have become basically second nature. They are part of the people's xing, but in an artificial way. And that such alteration can happen is actually said in the text. A little confusion can alter the sense of direction. A great confusion can alter the inborn nature, the xing. However, the discerning person would recognize that and not impose violence on them, but instead work around these standards to curb their influence and erode their grasp. The man with 2 toes webbed together would weep if he tried to tear them apart. The man with a sixth finger in his hand would howl if he tried to gnaw it off. Imposing violence to rip these excretions apart from those who have them would cause them distress and pain, regardless of the form of these excrescences. That is not to say that the primitivist considers these artificial features to be innocuous. They're still hurtful. Boluo's actions are still hurtful. But now that they have happened, the best way to deal with them is not through forcing things to go the other way. The worry these people feel about these superfluous fingers or missing toes may be unwarranted, but the one who wishes to deal with the artificial morals and standards of his time would do well not to cause any more worry about them. This includes using violence, and the people having a sixth finger forking off include the sage. Therefore, PNA seems to lead us to the conclusion that using violence when facing the artificial aspect of people's xing would be counterproductive and ill-advised. If we assume, and this is the last point I'll make, if we assume that the primitivists or the primitivists, we don't necessarily know if it was just one person, wrote those sections with at least the willingness for this section to be consistent with itself, or be, which is not necessarily the case in terms of being consistent with the rest of the Zhuangzi anthology, then a literal reading of the violent parts of Pian 10 is in contradiction with Pian 8. The former, so Pian 8 is against the use of violence on people's xing, even if it contains artificial elements, and Pian 8 would be if we follow literal reading, for the use of such violence against the expression of the sage's artificial xing. And I think that basically my reading enables us to recover this consistency. And again, that has no bearing with regards to the consistency of the primitivist section with other parts of the Zhuangzi. In terms of why that matters and what it means for the rest of the Zhuangzi, I've got a bit on that, but I think I'm already running over my 20 minutes, if that's correct. So I think I will just stop here